Hello from Bernheim. Hope you all are safe.
Hi from Bernheim.
Hi from Bernheim Forest.
Hi from Bernheim.
Hi from Bernheim.
Hi from Bernheim Arboretum.
Peace from Bernheim.
Hi from Bernheim Arboretum and Research Forest.
Hi from Bernheim.
Hello from Bernheim Forest.
Hi from Bernheim Forest.
Hi from Bernheim. I'm Rick Caldwell, and I hope you have a great day.
Hello from Bernheim.
Hey from Bernheim.
Good afternoon. I'm Richard Duran, the Association's Marketing and Communications Manager. The Dorothy E. Hansel Marketing Award is a tribute to a woman who stood for excellence in horticultural and botanical journalism. Hansel was editor of the New York Botanical Gardens Garden Journal, the newsletter and bulletin of the Holly Society of America, the American Bonsai Society Journal, and the APGA Bulletin. This award recognizes an outstanding marketing and communications campaign that powerfully advances a public gardens mission. The association is pleased to present 2 awards this year. Our first award recognizes the efforts of a garden that survived a direct hit by Hurricane Irma on the Gulf Coast of Florida in 2017. To support a fundraising campaign to help the garden recover, the garden's marketing team created an inspiring and uplifting look to use in all messaging, and a comprehensive marketing campaign emerged, including blogs, e-newsletters, social media posts, digital and print advertising, and 3 Garden Member Magazine features. The campaign raised more than $2 million from 526 donors, giving a total of 560 gifts to the garden's recovery efforts. But more importantly, the stewardship of these contributors continues to ensure a sustainable future. The association is proud to present the Dorothy E. Hansel Marketing Award to Naples Botanical Gardens' Replant and Regrow campaign. Our second award recognizes a campaign that advanced the garden's mission to discover and share knowledge about plants and their environment. On a shoestring budget of just $250 in Facebook advertising, plus some staff time, the garden attracted over 7,000 visitors and reached over 100,000 through social media in promotion of its first ever Tree Week during the fall of 2018. Even with those impressive numbers, the true measure of Tree Week's success was the attention it drew to the garden's living collection of trees, some of which date back to the garden's founding over 150 years ago. The association is proud to present the Dorothy E. Hansel Marketing Award to Missouri Botanical Gardens Tree Week.
Greetings from Mendocino Coast Botanical Gardens. Hope you're having a good time and wish you were here.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tommy Rosebluth, Program Coordinator at the American Public Gardens Association, and I will be your staff representative during this virtual conference. Before we begin, here are a couple of tips to get the most out of your virtual conference experience. First, if you're experiencing poor audio or video quality, we suggest closing other programs on your computer, especially other browser tabs. Your inbox will still be there at the end of the session, I promise. If you have any other problems or questions, association staff are available to help. Give us a call at 610-708-3010 or send us an email at info@publicgardens.org. Second, while this session has been pre-recorded, the presenters are here with us today as panelists and will be happy to take questions in the live question and answer portions of the session. At some point during this session, the presenters may activate a poll. Poll responses are anonymous, so be sure to let us know how you really feel. Finally, you can submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A function that you will find in your Zoom toolbar. Questions can be submitted anonymously. You can also upvote other questions to indicate you would like to hear them answered. We will try to answer as many questions as we can during the live Q&A portion of this session. Some questions may be answered directly through the Q&A feature. Thank you and enjoy today's session.
Hi, I'm Mary Burke from the UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden. Welcome to today's APGA session on adapting living collections for a changing climate. As you all know, there is no escaping this. This is work that we somehow will need to get done, and it's work that directors may be leading, but ultimately the work itself is going to be done by the boots on the ground staff at Botanical Gardens. And that's because this is who will be making decisions every single day to solve problems in real time that are ultimately going to be transforming our collections and making them future-proof. So thanks to all of you for joining us, but get ready because the pace will be really fast today. Because we want to make sure that we have a few minutes at the end for your questions, I've asked each presenter to show and go in just 15 minutes. And to make transitions between the three talks more seamless, I'm going to introduce all the speakers and their topics right now at the start to keep us on time. But don't worry, we will leave you all with plenty of links, handouts, and resources for you to follow up with us. So why do we think that you may need to be crafting a response for a changing climate for your garden and be starting that work in the not too distant future? Well, the climate is changing faster than we are, and action is urgently needed for both climate mitigation and to find ways to adapt to the new climates. However, there's still a critical gap. Many garden managers are wondering, how do we synthesize complex information about climate change and the risks and vulnerabilities our collections may have, and somehow integrate this understanding into real-world garden management plans and practices? So today's presentation will be highlighting a few practical approaches that some gardens are taking that are helping them translate big conceptual frameworks and ideas to actionable projects and community programs, and especially steps that are helping them make sure that the on-the-ground work that their teams are doing is aligning with what we already know about how the climate has already changed, plus with what scientists know about what may be ahead for our regions. So our gardens today, Australian, American, and Canadian, will be presenting ideas about how we can all help each other with issues about climate change. Plus, they'll be presenting some case studies that highlight how staff at Botanical Gardens can address the complexity and uncertainty that climate change has added to garden planning and management. Kicking off today's session are Claire Hart and Peter Symes from the Royal Botanic Garden Victoria at Melbourne, Australia. Their garden has been a leader in the worldwide effort to find practical solutions for transitioning living collections. And they'll talk about their own experience developing their own gardens, landscape succession strategy. They'll also share ideas about how we can help by being part of an emerging climate change alliance of botanic gardens. Following Claire and Peter, Lucas Griffith and Andrew Folks from the UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden will share their story about how their university garden has been collaborating with campus planning on a major climate adaptation plan. They will talk about how they've moved from big goals and guiding principles to a year one implementation plan, an immediate action plan that will help UC Davis make positive change right away on climate adaptation. Today's last speaker, Tara Moreau from the University of British Columbia Botanical Garden, will close the session by sharing some of the ways that changing policies and processes across multiple scales can be a powerful lever and make real change happen very quickly. Tara will also share some of the positive experiences her garden has gained through partnerships, both with traditional knowledge systems of First Nations and with regional governments. These partnerships have helped their garden meet objectives around community building, biodiversity, and food security strategies, plus help to align their garden goals with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Finally, a 10-minute question and answer session moderated by Shannon Still of the UC Davis Arboretum and Public Garden will wrap up our session. So if you have questions, please add them to the question and answer box in Zoom so Shannon can organize them. Okay, let's get started.
Hi, and welcome to the Royal Botanic Gardens Victoria, Melbourne Gardens. My name's Claire Hart, and I'm the Manager of Horticulture, and today I'll be presenting with Peter Symes, the Curator of Horticulture. Over to you, Peter.
So we want to tell you about the landscape succession strategy and how this strategy is going to transition this heritage landscape you see behind us through the challenges of climate change.
And the second part of this story is the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens and how the landscape succession strategy led to this Climate Change Alliance and how we want you to join. But first, before we go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathering. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to the elders of other First Nation communities who may be listening today. So let's start from the beginning. And Peter, I'm going to ask you if you could give us just some background and tell us a little bit about Melbourne Gardens.
Melbourne Gardens was created in 1846. The area covers 39 hectares or 96 acres. We're about 2.4 kilometres from the city. In the gardens themselves, we've got 20 living collections and 6,000 trees.
So why is this landscape so important?
The landscape's important for three reasons. One is its global diversity. We've got 8,000 taxa that represent over 190 countries, or 98% of the world states. It has strong heritage importance for protection. So next year we're 175 years old, so there's a legacy there that we need to protect. And it provides very important green space for the city. So it's the city's green space, and we need to continue that legacy into the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. You've identified the importance of this landscape, but what are the climate risks facing Melbourne Gardens?
Well, one risk is a significant change in mean annual temperature. So Melbourne was 14.7 or so degrees before the 1950s, and it's now up a bit over 16 degrees. So that's warmer than the global warming average. With the projections, we're looking at a mean annual temperature increase of 3 degrees, and so we're hitting up around 19 degrees C. So you see the temperature has really shifted dramatically. Precipitation is less strong, but it is trending down, so we are looking at significant loss in rainfall. But the more profound changes are probably in some of the extremes. So, for example, we're looking at a fourfold increase in days over 40 degrees C or over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're looking at an effective 20% loss in soil water balance, so it really has a big impact on irrigation sustainability.
So what you're saying is the climatic world in which this garden was created is now gone.
It's history, Claire.
Right. Well, okay. So look, this is one way of showing us a graph of what's occurring. But can you give us another example of what climate projection means?
Yeah, sure. I can give you another example. So the other way you can look at it is try and put the position of Melbourne in the climate future Melbourne in geographic terms. So if we look at Melbourne and try to imagine the climate of the future in 2090, we're looking at Melbourne moving 800 kilometres or 500 miles to the north. Now, in putting that in terms for our friends in the US, we're looking at the width of your typical US state or more. So really substantial shifts in climate facing us.
So why did Melbourne Gardens decide that a landscape succession strategy was the best way forward?
We realised we needed an integrated plan that brought together some of our existing plans, but also had a very strong climate change focus. It was a gap for us. We did look around the world. We thought there must be something like this that someone else has already done, and we conducted a worldwide literature review. We also looked at professional online groups, thousands of members, and asked this question. No one was able to respond to us. So we basically adopted a model on the ecology of vegetation succession to develop this strategy. Three of the key things we needed to do: we need to act now because we need to make decisions around trees, for example, that it means that they're suitable by 2090. We need to adapt this existing landscape for the future climate overall. And we also need to safeguard the important values of the garden, such as our education, our science, and our recreation.
So I'm just going to pause for a moment and look at this beautiful image here. Will the 2090 landscape look the same or similar?
I believe it will. I'm looking at this image now, and we actually don't need to replace too many species, but so many of the species in this actual image are actually suited to our current climate. A lot of the palms there, for example, dark green araucaria on the right, I can pick out a number of species already. So there's still a challenge, but there is some species that we can transition. And there's actually thousands of species that are suited to our future climate that we can choose from. So I'm quite confident.
This is a 20-year plan with a 70-year vision, and there's no blueprint. So who did you approach to create this strategy?
The technical content of the landscape succession strategy was actually largely completely in-house. We had in-house workshops involving a range of staff, but horticultural staff provided a large proportion of the content. Based on our experience, any organisation, large or small, can prepare their own strategic response to climate change.
And in putting this together, what did it highlight?
I'd like to actually share one research project that we commissioned with the University of Melbourne to really better understand our climate change risks.
Oh, wow. Okay. The climate risk assessment, it's a very strong spatial indicator of what Melbourne landscape is facing.
Yes, so this is showing a gridded, I suppose, climate risk across the landscape, and the red squares are your highest risk. So compared to our current climate, we're getting a doubling of risk. So 26% of our taxa are at the high risk range. The useful thing about this, it does provide a matrix for strategic planning in your landscape. So you can identify the hot areas, if you like, and these are the areas we need to devote more management attention, either by replacing species or by building in more protection for the plants that are growing there. The other point I'd like to make is this can actually help inform our species selection for the future and which species we might need to transition out, or species that might need protection. So we might move vulnerable species to another botanic garden, for example. There are many new species suited for a future climate. The key thing is that we're planning for that now.
So these are some of the principles that we've identified for landscape succession. Act now. Start today. Develop your understanding of climate change and what that means to the landscape that you manage and are managing for the future. Identify the risks. Prioritise species selection. Embrace adaptive management. And probably most importantly, collaborate and develop partnerships.
Claire, can you tell us about what was one of the broader impacts of the landscape succession strategy?
Well, we knew that this information had to be shared, Peter. So in December 2018, the Melbourne Gardens held the Botanical World's first Climate Change Summit. And this brought together a diversity of expertise, skills and cultures from across the globe. So for 3 days we had workshops, presentations, talks, and really dug deep into what climate change was doing to our gardens across the globe. From this, the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens was born.
So you've got the landscape succession strategy landed, and you've had a climate change summit, but why a global alliance?
It became so blatantly obvious. A realisation was that we cannot undertake this massive problem alone. Climate change is a worldwide problem. It doesn't respect borders, hence collaboration is absolutely critical to realising what we need to do. And here's a representation of our global partners and the beautiful and diverse landscapes that they manage across the world. And this image here puts faces to those gardens, and it actually shows the founding partners after signing the Melbourne Declaration to support a climate change alliance of botanic gardens.
I'm reading the purpose and I'm interested in the focus on adapting botanical landscapes through a changing climate. Why this focus?
It was agreed to really play to our strengths, and it was the opportunity for botanic gardens to do what they do best: plant collections and landscapes, conservation, education. This is our continuing legacy to share for the next generation. So first things first, Peter, we developed a set of principles to guide the Climate Change Alliance.
These principles included being able to be self-organising around a shared purpose, really recruiting for diversity, maintaining our energy, which is often so difficult, looking after our relationships to ensure that those partnerships were strong, and importantly, really planning for resilience and adaptability. And that is a feature of the living landscapes which we work and move. This means that the Climate Change Alliance will always be current, responsive, and never out of date.
So you've developed a set of principles, but what else have you done?
Well, one of the outcomes we achieved was the Landscape Succession Toolkit, and we delivered this to a couple of workshops, but notably at the BGANS Congress in Wellington, New Zealand. This was about providing a tool that people could use to develop their own landscape succession planning. And an interesting thing happened at this workshop. Because this was still in draft, we asked for all the copies to be returned, but by the end of the workshop, they'd all disappeared, including all the spare copies.
So with the landscape succession strategy as our foundation document, how do we start to assess some of the plants in our landscape?
One other outcome that the Alliance has achieved is the development of a pilot climate risk framework project. And this project looked at 20,000 species from around the world, including 12,000 threatened plants, which is probably the first time it's ever been done, and looked at quantifying their risk against mean annual temperature. And you can see from this image here, the red bars, we're looking at Acacia aspera, and we can look at where it starts to drop out against a mean annual temperature of 19 degrees. This provides a management tool for people who are growing this plant to say, okay, around 19 degrees, this could be a bit of a risk for this species. I need to do something about it. But more importantly, this project was a pilot. We're now looking at a much bigger project involving Botanic Gardens Conservation International, International Association of Botanic Gardens, and the Alliance to quantify climate risks for 60,000 trees across the world, which will also include the holdings of Botanic Gardens to make the risk assessment more robust.
I love it.
What's the point of doing all this work? Does it actually help?
I think one of the most fundamental outcomes is that we are paying a generation forward. We're ensuring that we have robust and future-proof landscapes. I think also, when you do the rigour of looking at and undertaking a landscape succession strategy, you've got a document there that donors are really interested in because they can see the effects of what the future might bring. We've also got the opportunity to increase our skill set and really capitalise on global expertise. Since the beginning of the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens, we've actually become a much more of a global, worldwide organisation, from Argentina to Colombia to the UK to the USA. Is your organisation on this list?
In the next 50 years, it's estimated that 20 to 50% of our current plants in botanic gardens and urban landscapes will likely confront temperatures those species have never experienced before. We must respond.
Climate change challenges are profound and a global response is essential. Our living world needs far less competition and much more collaboration. We invite you and your organisation to join the Climate Change Alliance for Botanic Gardens and bring your unique perspectives to craft botanic gardens for a changed world. You are the Alliance, and your first action is to take the pledge and join now.
And thank you for the opportunity to present at this conference today. We'd like to thank the American Public Gardens Association for inviting us to be part of this conference, and we thought we'd finish up here in Long Island, which is the Indigenous landscape here at the Melbourne Gardens.
And we warmly invite you to join the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens. We want to see you there.
Hello, I'm Lucas Griffith, the Director of Campus Planning here at UC Davis, and I'm joined by Andrew Folks, our Assistant Director of Arboretum and Public Garden. And we'd like to share and reflect upon some of our climate adaptation and resiliency works that we've been doing over the last few years. I'll focus on a framework for adaptation and resiliency, and Andrew will focus on the very hard work of translating this planning effort into everyday actions. Today we're going to go through 5 slides and these 5 themes. In general, my work focuses on the geography of place and what goes where and who goes next to who. With more than 5,000 acres here on the Davis campus, our planning efforts have parallels with city planning, but I particularly derive a lot of joy and satisfaction when working on the garden as a place and as a metaphor for stewardship and resiliency. Before getting into that, though, I'd like to offer my sincere appreciation for the efforts undertaken by the Royal Botanical Gardens in Victoria, who were originally inspired by their planning efforts, specifically the Landscape Succession Plan in 2016. Their work informed our approach to climate adaptation, and when we started, they generously and graciously shared their experiences, gave us advice, and helped us get our efforts underway. So thank you, Claire, for the powerful precedent. We appreciate the partnership as well as the great work you and your team have done and continue to do. So campus as a public garden. Campuses are very special places. You can all probably reflect upon and remember a campus that perhaps you experienced. They provide refuge from everyday life. They're special places. They are a break from the urban environs, and just like public gardens, they do that work. So a campus as a public garden might not make sense to you immediately, but it is absolutely part of what we do every day. As a place-based institution, the University of California here at Davis needs a garden that is open and gracious, legible and navigable. It brings people together, it stimulates joy and delight, it invigorates new ideas and new relationships. But the garden also offers prospect, knowledge, prospects of hope, opportunity, prospects of engagement with others and with our environment. So we've evolved over millennia to see light dance across the ground, the dappled light cast down from a forest canopy, and the animation provided by a soft breeze. So they grab our attention, they bring us an ease, a peace. So we're hardwired for the corporal world, for gardens. With all the uncertainty surrounding us these days, whether it's driven by COVID or climate change, let's not forget our DNA, our connections to the garden, and use our most fundamental nature to guide our everyday actions and long-term stewardship practices. So public gardens matter. Climate change matters. Today, I'd like to also have 2 points in this, one about place and one about climate change, within and specifically responding to the context of COVID. Our outdoor places, our outdoor gardens are more important than ever today. We've seen unprecedented numbers across our campus as people seek time outdoors and connections with another. COVID provides this great analogy in that global systems changed, local systems changed almost overnight. It wasn't just one system, it wasn't 2 systems, it was almost every system: transportation, economy, social system, education system. It's been an experience marked by uncertainty and continual change. This is a perfect analog for what we might imagine lie ahead with climate change. So let's do our best work to figure out and get ahead of the garden's equivalent of a pandemic. So as we began to think about adaptation for our campus, we went straight for the trees. The Arboretum and Public Garden has more than 20,000 trees across thousands of acres here in Davis. And the more we thought about trees, we found comfort in kind of an old idiom about seeing the forest for the trees. This idiom provides a great parallel for climate change, and that we know the specific particulars, research about climate change, but there's a massive gap between that inquiry and everyday stewardship practices in public gardens. So how do we translate knowledge into specific actions? How do we synthesize that complexity into actionable items? So with our focus on the forest, we embraced a longer view. A tree takes 20 years to mature, to grow up, another 50 to 100, even more to live. And with that timeline or horizon in mind, we had to think about the future climate and systems that would best serve that forest in the future for what we started to call climate tomorrow. Something that you couldn't just, lick your finger, stick it in the air and see which way the wind was blowing, because your site analysis of today isn't necessarily relevant or as relevant for tomorrow. So to help with this thinking and to process some of the complexity, we, of course, started thinking about a framework. Forests were key. They are fundamental to our sense of place on this campus. And part of that forest is its ecosystem, right? It's not just the canopy, but it's understory, it's soil, it's nematodes, the whole complexity of that system. And water, and they're making sure that we had a resilient water source to preserve that forest into the future. And through this all, we really expanded the notion of health. So it's the health of a regenerative ecosystem, but also the health of individuals that nurture a healthy community, that have enhanced partnerships, and then even improve the fiscal health of the institution. So with that, we emphasize partnerships as one of our key frameworks as well. So the social impacts directly amplifies our partnership and our external support. So with a framework in hand, we began to search for a process that would help us translate principles into actions and adapt our gardens for climate change. You could essentially say, in stage right walks the USDA Climate Hub. We were really fortunate when Mary Burke came into my office and shared Forest Adaptation Resources Manual with us. And I was like, we have a forest. This is exactly what we're looking for. And they have a 5-step process that was incredibly helpful for us. The fundamental part and approach that we went through for this workshop was empowering everyday practitioners to reflect upon what they do and their management practices. So the define here is define your management goals and objectives and empower those everyday stewards to bring forth what they are doing and what they are seeing. To assess which aspects of the garden, plant collection, or other natural resources have the highest value to you and your team, to evaluate the potential climate change impacts and determine what is at risk, and then to identify and brainstorm management actions in response to those risks. And then, as always, monitor and evaluate your progress towards climate-ready landscapes. The first step of this provided, again, a great insight to our everyday practices and much more explicit and intentionality to how we show up every day. And from that came an understanding of our 5,000 plus acres that have very different management structures. So there's the core campus, which would be your traditional campus landscape, a quad with some lawn and some trees. We have the traditional arboretum and learning landscapes where there's this museum mission. We have environmental reserves and wildlands. These 3 broad categories of landscapes have very different and fundamentally different management practices. And yet the forest that we're so eager to preserve and enhance over the next few years spans these divides. And so how do we integrate across these pieces? Really led to the work that Andrew, I think, is going to be picking up at this point.
All right. Well, thanks, Lucas, for giving me that intro. I'm Andrew Folks, Assistant Director at the UC Davis Arboretum Public Garden. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about just the tail end of the planning and then jump into the actions that we're taking on campus as a result of a lot of the work that Lucas has been doing, as well as the USDA workshop. So to give kind of a little overview of the USDA workshop, I'm going to start off with a very quick video that highlights a little bit about what we did.
Hello, and welcome to the online adaptation workbook. The workbook is a step-by-step process that will help you consider how climate change might affect your land management and conservation goals. While you're using the workbook, you'll be asked to enter your management goals and objectives, consider potential climate change impacts, and brainstorm management actions for adaptation. When you're all done, you'll have a customized adaptation plan that is unique to your property or project area. Before you begin, it might be helpful to gather information about your property or project area, such as maps, management plans, or inventory data. You might also want to download the Forest Adaptation Resources document or Adaptation Resources for Agriculture, which both make great companion guides for the online workbook. The online workbook is self-guided, so you'll be in charge of deciding how much detail to provide and when to take breaks. There are a few ways to move from step to step in the workbook: the left-hand navigation menu and the next link at the bottom of each screen. The workbook will auto-save your information every few seconds, so you won't need to look for a save button. This also means you can log out whenever you're ready for a break. Just log back in and pick up where you left off. Click the Get Started button when you're ready to begin.
So we started off with this process and did some preliminary work and then had in-person sessions where the entire Arboretum Public Garden team got together. And prior to the workshop, we did as the video suggested, where we went through the goals and objectives. And as Lucas was talking about, we have the three different landscape types. And without going through all of the ones line by line, this is just to sort of give an overview generally of some of the broader goals and objectives we have with the various types. So this one's the Arboretum and learning landscapes. And some of the high-end goals were protecting and conserving high-value trees, for example, diversity, health, and structure of the tree collection, human and ecological services of the Arboretum trees. So you can already see we're getting kind of tree focused on this, and you'll see that come through with the rest of what we've been looking at. So in the workshop, we started identifying in smaller breakout groups based upon those three different landscape types, various workshop actions. And so you can see here some of the sheets we were working with. Within this, we identified some key areas where we had interest in doing various types of projects. So I'll move my mouse here. You can see like swale restoration in this one section of the Arboretum, oak grove conservation and testing of new species before we roll them out in other areas, expanding oak grove areas and conversion of turf. Turf is one of our higher water use landscapes types, but also a real important landscape type for human use and human recreational use. So trying to balance the quantity that we have with the demand that we have. And then as an outcome of that, started listing what we had put down on the maps into key ideas and actions related to each of the landscape types. So for example, and there were three of these, but again, the time allotted, I'll just kind of talk about the core in this particular instance. We're talking about the preservation of the core turf and tree canopy. So core turf being things like the quad, right? That's kind of the heart of the campus. The campus has grown out from the quad. Used to be the campus coordinate system was based around the center point of the quad. So it has a lot of historical value, cultural value, and emotional value. We're going to have more days with extreme heat, increased frequency of and duration of those hot days, and altered seasonal precipitation. So either more water, less water, or quote-unquote average. So we looked at a lot of adaptations, and you'll see here everything from changing infrastructure for irrigation and water delivery to changing some of the turf and tree species. And the outcome, universally amongst the three landscape types, from folks that were involved and this process, was really that trees and water are the two top priorities. Now we have many actions within the rest of the categories, but really for the focus of this talk, it's sort of the things that rose to the top, and trees and water were really the top. So some of the key early actions we're going to be taking in the next calendar year related to trees. One, we're going to be integrating all information about our trees into something we call the One Tree database. So right now, we're taking all of the campus data and we're shifting that into a single point of contact, One Tree database. We're developing a student tree team internship. One very large part of the campus is experiential learning, and our learning by leading teams use student leadership and mentorship with staff and faculty to run student internships where students work on real-world projects in real time on the campus. And so this student tree team will be doing everything from monitoring to database work to young tree care to planting of trees. So we're investing students into the place, and long-term, that's how we see sustainability for the place, because students become future donors, they become future advocates. You want to give them ownership of the place. Next, we have experiment with new tree species on campus. So as the climate changes, we have models that Shannon's been working on with our other faculty, and those models give projections. What might our climate be like? So we're doing a lot of work in Southern California and Texas in particular, New Mexico, with a collection of oaks and bringing them up here and starting to try them in the landscape. And as we do that, we're going to be gathering data on the performance with the student tree team doing some of that data collection. So water, realizing, water is, especially here, the lifeblood of everything from agriculture to urbanization to landscapes that we like to the wildlife areas. So we're looking at kind of three different things, and all of these, of course, are in partnership with other campus units from facilities to utilities. Number one is to capture more water on site. So we're doing a lot more altering of topography of the campus to capture more rainfall. So rather than having the old school, 1950s era when the bulk of the campus growth occurred, everything gets shunted to a storm drain and then pushed off site. Right now it's retain it on site, charge that soil, not just the groundwater, but provide extra soil moisture so that when we do have hot summer conditions, trees may be able to handle it better without as much supplemental water in the future. So in this particular site, they're recontouring to create a detention basin that you can see down here during one of our rainstorms, which is filling up, and then we'll charge that soil. So that's increasing the infiltration. It also captures sediment. So instead of having it run off the parking lot and into the storm drain, it will run into a detention basin. That sediment will settle out. So the water that eventually goes into the storm drain, if it overflows, is cleaner water. And then lastly, diversification of our water sources. We actually are quite lucky here at UC Davis. We have several different water supply sources. We have groundwater, which is through wells, and we are trying to reduce the amount of use because that water does have a lot more mineral in it, a lot more salts, is harder on the trees. We are capturing the rainwater, as I just talked about. And we also have two different surface water sources. We have the Sacramento River water, which we have through a joint project with the City of Woodland and City of Davis that delivers surface water to the campus. So what we do have an opportunity for, which we're working on with utilities, is for Lake Berryessa water. And this is to the west of us in the Inner Coast Range. And Lake Berryessa is not a snow-fed lake, and not through snowmelt, it is through rainfall. And most of the climate projections show that if anyone's going to do good in their storage, it's going to be those that are rainfall-fed reservoirs, because we'll probably have fewer storms but more intensive storms, and these are designed to handle that. The university has 4,000 acre-feet that we have purchased from there when in 1958 the dam was built. We bought 4,000 acre-feet of water. We have the opportunity to redirect that supply, of which we have a bit of a surplus, into our utility water system, which will feed campus landscape. So looking at the holistic water picture is a very important part of going forward when you're talking about the landscape. And then lastly, the last item, last slide here, is landscape conversions. So converting both higher water use landscapes to lower water use, but with increased biodiversity. And so Lucas talked about sort of the understory and the midstory. These are some examples of that, where we are converting this area that was all lawn in the courtyard of a building. So what had been a turf area that didn't really have a lot of educational value is now kind of the core of several classes that are happening on campus. The other thing is different approaches for each landscape type. So in an area like this is on West Campus in a more remote distribution facility for our campus mail system. This is an area that's a stormwater drainage that goes into a detention basin that goes directly into the creek. This had been maintained bare because it was purely about flooding. We are converting that into a wildlife corridor and a hedgerow corridor. So hopefully that gave everybody kind of a very quick but broad overview of some of the actions on the ground that we are currently taking directly as a result of taking this workshop and working through the planning process with Lucas and the rest of the Arboretum Public Garden team. So thank you.
Hello, my name is Tara Moreau, and I am Associate Director for Sustainability and Community Programs at the UBC Botanical Garden in Vancouver, Canada. I am really privileged to get to work at this beautiful garden, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit from a different angle about some of the programs and the policy work and really education around climate science and engaging people in climate science and having them understand the role of botanical gardens more broadly and what we can do. So this is an aerial photo of our garden. You're looking at our food garden and our physic garden and our parts of our alpine garden. And we are at a beautiful location at the south end of campus overlooking the Pacific Ocean. We also have the incredible privilege of managing the Nintobe Memorial Garden. I just wanted to express my thanks to the Portland, who were going to be our hosts this year. Sorry that we can't be there, but hoping to visit there very soon. Before we get started, I wanted to give a land acknowledgement. This is very common in Vancouver and at the University of British Columbia and increasingly in Canada. And so I want to, while I'm streaming here from my house today, I want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations and pay respect for the enduring relationships between Indigenous people and the territories that we are on. You are welcome to learn more about the territories and the traditional land that you are on. There's a great tool called native-land.ca. So this is the narrative that we are increasingly seeing around climate change, the threats that face in for plants and for those of us in botanical gardens working against time to tackle and prevent extinction. So in the words of Paul Smith from BGCI, we have all the tools we need and no plants should go extinct. But how do we as botanical gardens tackle the complexity of climate change, and how do we do this currently today in the face of COVID-19? And while we're at it, how do we rebuild back better so that we're also tackling the root causes of injustice and increasing the diversity of people who are at our gardens and the voices of people involved with horticulture, gardens, and conservation. So I think it all starts with storytelling and reframing our narratives. And with a different story, I want to tell a story of being radical. And as a climate scientist, I've always struggled with this term of being radical. I wanted to be seen as a scientist within these communities and not being a radical advocate. And increasingly over the last 5 years, what I've realized is that being radical is something that we shouldn't be afraid of. Radical, if we think about the botanical terms, a radical is the first part of a seed to emerge. It is the true embryonic root of the plant, and it grows downward into the soil. And so I'm hoping today to tell a story about how I'm trying to be radical and get to the root cause of the things that are challenging our society today. And part of that is sharing some different ideas. And so I've been really fascinated in doing a lot of my programming, aligning the work at our botanical garden to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. For those of you that this is a new topic, they were adopted in 2015 and are our only global strategy for sustainable development. They will take us till 2030. 2020 to 2030 is marked as our decade of action. And I want to give a caveat. They're not perfect. There's some critiques of the SDGs, as their acronym is called, but I think that they're the best that we have. And I see there's a great potential for botanical gardens and this amazing global network of botanical gardens to align to the global goals around a shared collective vision of increasing the sustainability of our planet. So in terms of thinking about radical offerings, I wanted to share some of the guiding principles that guide me. And so much of my work is around solutions, bringing forward actions around mitigating climate change. How do we adapt to climate change, to the expected and unexpected impacts? How do we bring in climate justice? I think as part of this, a key element is thinking about resiliency and building resiliency both into our gardens and into our plants, but also into the people that work on our teams, the volunteers, the staff, the students, and the guests that come and visit us. A key element to me is understanding behavioral science. I got into science by being and studying insect behavior, and I realized that actually, while insect behavior is fascinating in the context of biodiversity, we need to tackle human behavior. This is a great resource that I'd like to refer people to learn more about behavioral science. And lastly, I'm going to talk today about leveraging partnerships. Botanical Gardens, my department, my team, we're relatively small, and so trying to work with my allies within the community to increase the impact that we're trying to make. And so this is my complicated vision of how we can consider policy landscapes, and how can gardens consider the programs that they run, the plans that they make, that they align across multiple jurisdictions and can serve different audiences at different levels. One of the things that I think is important when we talk about gardens and the roles that we can make is we need to think and ask questions of what will our garden look like in 100 years? What will our garden look like in 400 years? I think in asking these questions, we also need to look in the past. This is a photo approximately 100 years ago of the garden's first site on campus, and understanding the role of the garden, where we have been and where we're going, is really essential. This is the current vision and mission that our garden is working on, and this is guiding our work, and currently our team is unpacking this in more detail and understanding what do we mean by education, what research do we want to focus on, conservation priorities, and in order to bring our whole team into a strategic alignment. Douglas Justice, who runs our collection, he likes to talk about our biodiversity rules. And these guide us, but we also know that biodiversity does rule as an adaptation tool. Increasing the complexity of our ecosystems within our gardens will help to improve resilience. And so guiding principles, these are ones that we're talking about how to create and build in resilience as best we can within our collection and communicate this out also to our community. Much of my job involves less with working with plants and more with people. And so I've learned from the association and amazing colleagues within the association about how do we connect and think about biocultural diversity. As we are fighting to conserve plants, how do we also conserve the traditional knowledge associated with those plants? And so our team started a year and a half ago. We did a training with an Indigenous facilitator, Brad Marsden, to explore truth and reconciliation in terms of bringing our team on board as being good stewards of the land that we're on. In 2019, we aligned a lot of our programming to the 2019 UN Year of Indigenous Languages and worked closely with Vanessa Campbell and Musqueam Indian Band to explore how can we bring the knowledge of Hunkaminam, which is the traditional Indigenous language, in one of the traditional Indigenous languages in our area, and integrate that into what we're doing into the Botanical Garden, both in our collections, but in our communications out. The Sustainable Communities Field School is a program I've been running for 5 years. This is a slightly different program, but this program is a donor-supported program that has really galvanized and helped me leverage the work that I've been doing. 3 years ago, we aligned this program to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and really the goal here was to target corporate groups locally in order to bring in new people into the garden and to support greening the economy. So over the last 5 years, we've brought in 85 different teams, close to 2,500 people, and this is really engaging adults in trying to get teams and working together to talk about sustainability and to share stories so that they can practice having a collective discussion around sustainability and what is required. The current challenge that we're facing in this program, it's all about team building. It's all about bringing large groups out together. And so now we need to think about how do we pivot in the face of COVID. And with this, I think I draw and I rely on my partnerships. In the middle there is Oliver Lane. He's the executive director at the Society Promoting Environmental Conservation. They are a key partner working with us on the Field School program. And it is through these partnerships that we are sharing ideas about how to pivot and change our program. We don't yet know what that looks like, but I'm gonna sort of shift and just talk about some of these great partnerships and how I use our partnerships to increase the capacity of our team. So this is our food garden. I could have a whole hour talk about the power of food gardens, the role of agriculture as a sector in impacting biodiversity. But I just wanted to showcase, this is one of my favorite photos taken. We have students, we have our friends at the garden working together to harvest food, weigh the food. Eventually we cooked the food and we shared the food together. And I think this is the goal of gardens. We're bringing people, we want them to connect to plants, but we also can use these spaces to have more difficult conversations. We can talk about inequality in food systems. We can talk about agriculture and its impacts on biodiversity, as well as we can raise the awareness of the many hands who help to grow and produce our food. We are a university botanical garden. We are Canada's oldest university botanical garden. And so part of our staff, we work closely with campus and community planning, has a biodiversity steering committee called Seabird. And so we've been working with this group to try to consider and explore how do we better conserve biodiversity on campus. UBC is well known for its international researchers, but we lack certain policies that are protecting biodiversity of trees and other species on campus. So we're working with this cross-campus community and trying to understand what knowledge we have within the university and how do we connect more to the regional government and to other local governments. That brings me to a program that we run called the Grow Green Guide. We've been running this for about 3.5 years. In collaboration with our regional government, Metro Vancouver. And this is a really interesting partnership. They reached out to us. They wanted to support the public in putting in gardens. And they also wanted to encourage water-wise gardens, supporting pollinators, native plants. And so we've been working with them for a number of years on this. And the power of these partnerships over the last few weeks, we decided, because gardening was a very popular topic, to do some live stream videos. We've done 3 and we had incredible viewership. Close to 30,000 people were tuning into these live stream videos around how do you get started with a food garden, how do you take back the turf and consider using lawn alternatives. And so again, just working with those in our region who share the same values that we do around supporting plants and biodiversity, as well as considering and adapting to climate change. And Metro Vancouver actually has been taking a lead in developing some climate adaptation strategies, identifying tree species that are expected to survive under future climates. So working as a garden with our regional government also allows us to be on the front lines of when this information is coming out and using that to integrate into our own thinking. And one of my favorite topics that I work in, and I would say probably one of the most complicated topics to communicate to people, is conserving and talking about crop wild relatives. These are the ancestors of our food plants. And when I talk about crop wild relatives, I think of them as our deep adaptation work, conserving the genetic traits of plants that are closely related to our food plants so that we can prepare future generations and provide plant genetic information to allow for future breeding. This has been really a lot of work has galvanized with the food and agriculture community, which is part of the association. A few of us, Sarah Beck and Ari Novi and myself, got really excited about Gary Naphan's book, Where Our Food Comes From, a number of years ago. And it's interesting, a story of one book led to a conference, which was last April in Des Moines, Iowa, around celebrating crop diversity. And from that, a number of publications came out from gardens. And this whole work was around bringing agricultural researchers together with botanical gardens to share knowledge and expertise of how we communicate complexity of science to the public and engage them. Today, actually, I'm thrilled that we're applying for a grant to continue this work. We had launched a roadmap to conserve crop wild relatives in North America, and I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that we'll get the funding to be able to create an implementation plan for crop wild relative conservation in North America. And lastly, I wanted to finish with a bit of a story. In November, I had the incredible privilege through the Botanical Garden Network to go to Shenzhen, China, to the Fairy Lake Botanic Garden. And I spent 5 days there. And Dr. Jianlin Zhao, who's in the middle of that picture in the bottom, had been key in having this social innovation conference held there, where we had there was 1,200 people gathered in Shenzhen working on solutions towards the SDGs. And I was in the track on climate action. And spending 5 days with youth was incredible. And we would often talk about climate action. And over the course of these 5 days, our whole narrative shifted slightly from being advancing climate action to advancing climate justice. And I think as gardens are thinking about being active and thinking about mitigating their impacts on climate change, as well as creating adaptation plans, I think we have this incredible opportunity to center that around climate justice in our communities in order to create justice for both people and the planet. So with that, I wanted to share my final thanks to Mary Burke, who has been incredible at bringing together this session. She said, and in some emails as we prepared for today, she said, just dare to be average. And I want to acknowledge, because I would say Mary is not your average person, and I know she's retiring very soon. So she has, is encouraging us to dare to be average, but she has been exceptional. So thank you so much. And I look forward to any questions.
Okay, I want to thank you for all our panelists for the presentation. That was great, and hopefully gives a nice introduction to what we're doing, because this is far from over. But my name is Shannon Still. I'm at UC Davis Public Garden, Arboretum and Public Garden. I want to mention that, so we have all these we've gone through a lot of this information. It's a lot to take in, and we don't have very long for question and answer session. So the first thing I want to say is that while this is going to go very quickly, we would like this dialogue to continue. And we are getting some questions through on our site through the questions and answers. We'll attempt to get through all of those, and we've already started to address some of those, but we'd also like to continue this discussion further. So if you would like to follow up with an email to Mary Burke or myself, so you could send those to us or to any of the panelists, and we could get those questions around to everybody and try to address those. So one thing, there was a question that was asked, and I think we attempted to answer, but the first question was, how can a garden get started on the process of making itself more resilient to climate change? Any advice about first steps for beginners? Do any of the panelists just want to briefly kind of have a synopsis of what we covered there?
I'm more than happy to start if that's okay. So it's Claire Hart speaking, from the Royal Botanic Gardens in Melbourne. I think one of the fundamental things that we did or undertook was to look at what we had, so to do that strategic landscape assessment. And we have those tools, or a copy of that available online, so people will be able to access that just to see what the basic principles are. But one of the simple things that we did was and once that was done, it was literally just to start thinking about your landscape and some very simple changes. And that can be as simple as, in particular, long-lived species and what trees you are planting, and to make sure you do a climate risk assessment on that. Probably one of the other things that we did, because this is management speak from me, but I manage a team of horticulturists on ground. So our focus and what we brought into any of our landscape projects was that any project or any change was a landscape succession project or change. So like we do assessments on weed risk, or like we do assessments on how we're going to irrigate or water management for that, the focus also now delivered on landscape succession. So that's an immediate concept that our on-ground horticulturists ask us straight away. What are we going to be doing to change the landscape for a future-proof, not just for the next year, 5 years, 10 years? So that's probably the simplest thing that I can say at this point.
Okay. I know that Lucas had a good point when you ask about what's the first step you would want. We have some toolkits that were mentioned during the presentations, and those are a great way to get started once you actually know that this is something you want to do. But one thing we really had to learn at Davis is that we had to go through this process of, why are we doing this? And so, you know, we looked at what other people had done. We did some stuff that the Forest Service had done in Chicagoland region. And then we looked at what Peter, their group, had done and started to develop our own. And that's how a lot of this from our end came about. So it's kind of, you need to have some of these discussions at your own site based upon your own values, because not everyone's going to have the same solution. But we can all use the same basic framework and reasoning. But it's, you know, we may want to do models like environmental models to see what trees might be important in our area. That may not be as important for other people. Maybe it's more of the water use, but maybe it's more of a cultural thing. So this is a very involved process, but you do have to figure out what your site really needs.
It's Peter here. I just wanted to jump in. In our experience, we actually started from very much a horticultural basis. So we undertook to understand what our holdings were and what the risk was with those. And that was all done by in-house teams working with the climate tools that we had at the time. So we were using climate classifications, but it was all done by horticulturalists, and we determined that we did have appeared to be a significant risk to our holdings. So we knew there was a risk. We then had to look at what were the benefits and the assets, what were the important things that we needed to protect. So weighing up the risk with the protection that was required. And this was all done in-house. So I'm just encouraging anybody who's starting this to start somewhere, because as you start the process, you start to develop information and improve your process. And I can only give you the experience from our team that it wasn't done by consultants to start with. It was done in-house. So we believe any organisation can actually do this from that basis.
And I'll make one addition to that about the toolkit that's available through the U.S. Forest Service is we did end up having consultants come and help us run the 3-day workshop. But they have told us because of the pandemic, they teach online classes in this, and they normally cost something. But this fall, they're going to make their, I can't remember if it's 6, 7, or 8 weeks, but it's a once-a-week online class that will take you and or your team through the entire process. Their goal is that it gives you homework each week. And so by the end of the 6 or 8 weeks, you'll have at least a framework to start with. You'll have gone through at least one level of the steps. So it's just another opportunity. A lot of this information will be on our handouts, which will go out to all the audience members. So.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions we want to try to get to, and I think, Peter, are you going to try to attempt to address these?
I'm happy to have a go, but I'm sure the others can jump in.
Yeah, one was how has cost affected plans for making these changes to your gardens?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that one. Given that we're usually the end of the team that does the implementation. So cost clearly impacts everything that we do. I look at it from the standpoint of look at what resources you currently have that you're putting into the garden or whatever landscape you're managing, and see if you're deploying them in the way that you want to, right? So if you've got a certain amount of money for tree replacement, make sure that you're replacing with the right trees. If you've got a certain amount for maintenance of your garden beds, make sure that you are leveraging that the best that you can. So typically what we do when we first start with any kind of thing is we look at what resources we have and how we can redeploy those the most effectively before we start going in and asking for additional resources. Because we're really talking about a transformation in the way that we're working here and a transformation in the way that we're managing. So most projects, they scale to the amount of dollars you have, right? So it doesn't mean that you can go and do all of the plan all at once. Generally, it means that you can do as much as you can with the resources you have. So when looking at making these changes, do that. Definitely inventory all the resources and assets you have and how you can best deploy them to make the changes you want to make. And that's how we've done it.
Okay. We have about 2 minutes left. I know we have one more question. Was there any other brief thing for that from the panelists? Are we good?
What I might just say is,
go ahead.
well, in terms of cost, I would say it kind of relates to the first question as well, is, you know, the first step that we've been taking internally at UBC is talking about joining the Alliance for one, which is free of cost. It takes staff time to do that. But I think that's an easy sort of next step for people to explore. And we just signed the Alliance last week. So we're very new to it, but I think it started to galvanize internal discussions with our management team. And then increasingly, we're going to now open it up with our horticulturalist team. But I think what Andrew was saying too, around how do you reassess what your current assets and to redeploy them, to me is actually a great framing to think about how we can move this forward.
Super. Okay, we got about 1 minute. So one last question from any of the panelists. What has been the single most helpful resource for your gardens in the process?
I mean, just briefly, one thing that I could offer is just what we really got from the USDA Climate Hub workshop was starting with where you're at and checking with your staff. And they are the boots on the ground and the hands-on plants, and whether they're horticulturalists, botanists, groundskeepers. And it gets back to what your kind of core funds are anyway that you're doing. And so every day you got folks out there tending the earth. Starting there is very empowering. It's empowering for them to be heard, to listen to them, but also to empower them to be leaders and kind of be inquisitive about it. So that's kind of what I really took away from kind of our process and what we've garnered from others.
And I'd just say it would be absolutely fantastic if anyone listening joined the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens. It is a free resource. We have how you can develop, how you can start with a very basic toolkit for landscape succession, but also we're looking at that climate risk assessment framework, which is to be shared. It is a global tool that we can all use. So I highly recommend, it's free. We can all start sharing. The one way that we can affect climate change is through our collaborative global expertise.
And I'll close up, Tommy, by saying...
Okay, quickly.
Okay,
Got a couple
one
seconds
thing
here.
I've really seen is, every single panelist mentioned partnerships. And so we're all available to any garden that wants to reach out to us and need some help getting started.
All right, well, thank you all so much. If you'd like to keep the discussion going, please click the live discussions tab on the conference website and start a topic. We'd like to thank our presenters and all of you for being a part of today's session. At 3:20, so right about now, you have a difficult choice between 3 more wonderful concurrent sessions before we wrap up the day with a special session at 4 p.m. and finally our virtual conference send-off at 4:45. Thanks again for attending and see you at the next session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.